Hey everyone, Elizabeth here again. Just checking in for the week. I thought I would try a different kind of format this time. I've not been able to update that often because I'm reading two really difficult books, Strawson's Individuals, which is just pure analytic philosophy, and then Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror, which is not difficult to read, but it's just really, really long. And I've been sitting here taking all these notes, feeling like I can't comment on it until I finish the books. And it kind of made me feel stressed out, like I needed to rush through these books, and it was actually making me read them a little bit less, like avoid them. So I thought I would try to change up the format, and instead of waiting, for in a long-term way until I've finished my reading, I thought I would do instead what I've seen other people do on BookTube, which is kind of like more like a check-in, like maybe every week or every 2 weeks, where I just talk about my reading, whether or not I've finished a book, whether or not I can speak on the entirety of the book. So I thought that would be an interesting thing to try. I've seen some other people do it. I think some people call it Friday Reads. So I'm going to try to do that instead. So I think today I'm going to focus on P.F. Strawson's Individuals and mostly focusing on giving some context to the project because I think that's what makes analytic philosophy so difficult to approach sometimes. And then the other book I'll be talking about is A Distant Mirror by Barbara Tuchman. And then at the end, I think I'll talk a little bit about other projects I'm doing, like some language learning. I'm taking a class on opera, so I have a few thoughts on those things. And I also want to try maybe just including a few interesting links every time I post, just in the description, just because I come across things that I think are interesting and I'd like to share them. So I think in this one, I've got a link on whether or not left turns should be banned. Left turns in places where we drive on the right side of the road should be banned. And I have a lot of thoughts on this because the closest I ever come to getting into car crashes is to do with left turns. But I've never heard anyone talk about this particular problem that I face pretty often in my small town. And I made a little diagram so I can explain it for you here. Okay, so this is what I often find myself up against, this situation that causes so much turmoil for me. So generally, I'll be driving along and there will be me at a normal following distance and then someone tailgating someone else just up ahead of me. And they're tailgating so close that very often I can't even see that there's anyone right in front of them. And what will happen is this person in the orange car will slow down to a stop because they want to take a left at the intersection and there's too much traffic, so they can't immediately go. So this person stops, and the person tailgating, instead of slowing down or putting on the brakes in any way, will suddenly, at the very last second, in a smooth manner, just sort of go on to the other lane and then just shoot ahead like this. And it'll happen so quickly that suddenly I've got this orange car in front of me that's completely stopped, that I'll have to sort of like, I'll be going along at a normal pace still because I couldn't see the car before. And I'll have to just really slam on the brakes in order not to crash into this sudden object that's completely stopped in the middle of the road. So you don't get any warning that you need to stop because this guy never slowed down. He just moved out of the way of a stationary object at the last second, thinking he's really cool, and then you have to sort of emergency brake before you get hit. It's a huge pet peeve of mine, and I come across it more and more. So that's my feeling on. Does anyone have a name for that? Like, does anyone know if there's a name for this kind of maneuver? Because I see it a lot, especially in New York State, actually, where they tend to drive really, really close to one another and really, really quickly. I've seen it almost cause accidents with people who were driving in front of me, actually. It's pretty scary, and I wish there were a way to more easily talk about it, but I can't think of like a pithy name for it. So, anyway, to get right into it, so the first book I want to talk about is Barbara Tuchman's A Distant Mirror. And I've finished about 3/4 of the book now. It's quite long, and I've just had other projects that I've been doing, so I haven't gotten through it as quickly as I've wanted to, but it's actually a very easy read, and I encourage anyone who is intimidated by high page counts to try it out, because it's really more like a narrative history. It's not dry and, one thing after another, although it can be sometimes. I shouldn't get ahead of myself. My impressions of it so far, I have a few notes here. I started off on the wrong foot, and that's why I think that I really would I want to warn other people and want to encourage people not to be dissuaded the way I almost was. But in the introduction, I was really, really worried about presentism. This book was written in about the 1970s, and it's about the calamitous 14th century is the subtitle. And Barbara Tuchman makes a number of comparisons between 1970s America and 14th century Europe that seemed completely inappropriate to me. So she sort of suggests that the reason we can revisit the plague now is because current times, which is the United States in the 1970s, are so terrible that finally we can look back unblinkingly at the Black Death. And to me, that's an astonishing claim, to say the least. I have a quote here from Barbara Tuchman on what it was like during the Black Death. So she says here, Clement VI found it necessary to grant remissions of sin to all who died of the plague because so many were unattended by priests. Quote, "And no bells tolled," wrote a chronicler of Siena, "and nobody wept no matter what is lost, because almost everyone expected death. And people said and believed, this is the end of the world." It seems almost in a way hubristic to compare an oil crisis in the 1970s to that kind of calamity, especially when Barbara Tuchman at the time was only a few decades removed from World War II. But I did notice that she never really brings this up again after the introduction. And my guess is that an editor or someone outside of her project told her that she needs to bring in current events to sort of have a hook, so to speak, so that she could sell the book. And A Distant Mirror was a cool title, and so she was just sort of forced to shove that into the introduction. I've seen this happen a number of times, including behind the scenes, when you have a historical project and you're forced to answer the question, so what? And so what means bring it into current times, even if it's not really relevant. So I give Barbara Tuchman a pass on that, and I'm glad I wasn't scared off by the introduction, because I found very quickly that she's a really colorful and engaging writer, actually. You can just sort of sit back, relax, and have her stories of the 14th century sort of wash over you. She's very good at picking out little anecdotes here and there that really provide a lot of color to what the 14th century was really like, even though most of the book is about royals and great people and the big people, as we might say, who are changing history. She still manages to give you a little bit of a sense of what it was like at that time, just in general, the atmosphere. So I've got a few lines here of some of the lovely details she includes. For instance, she notes how Noah and his family were taken to indicate the proportion of those who would ascend to heaven. That's usually estimated as 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000. So that's the kind of world that people were living in the 14th century. They thought only 1 in 1,000 or 1 in 10,000 people would go to heaven. That's quite a psychological burden to be living with. And I had no idea that was their inclination. Another one is, in an emergency and given a good horse with no load and a good road, both rare, a man could ride about 15 miles per hour in the 14th century. And with changes of horse, he could cover about 100 miles a day in the very best circumstances, while armies sometimes covered no more than 8 miles a day. This really gives you an insight into the medieval world, how huge it was, just to travel within your own, what we would think of as the boundaries of nation states today. I always have wondered how fast or slow riding by horseback is. I never really had a very particular or very precise impression. So that was really something I hooked on to, because it was something sort of I wanted to know, but I didn't realize I wanted to know it. And it really informs a lot of the later descriptions she has of people traveling backwards and forwards. So I thought that was interesting. Um, She's got stuff on. Oh, this is another one where it was like, oh yeah, I never thought to ask this question. How did women ride horses? They didn't have the side saddle yet. Well, they rode astride the horse, just like a man, with huge billowing skirts to protect their modesty. And then later, near the end of the century, the side saddle was introduced. So just these little details are interesting. And she never is too busy to stop the story, the main story that she's discussing, in order to sort of go down a side road and tell you something interesting. One of my favorites is a quote on medieval stagecraft and the flair for the dramatic, so to speak. So I knew they had plays and things, but I never knew this stuff in as much detail. So she has, at a banquet given in Coucy's time by a certain Vidame de Chartres, the ceiling, painted like a sky, opened up to allow the dinner to descend on machines resembling clouds, which raised the dishes again when they had been emptied. An artificial storm lasting half an hour accompanied dessert, dropping a rain of scented water and a hail of sweetmeats. Doesn't that sound fantastic? I wish I could have gone to a dinner like that. For the miracle plays, I'd always heard of these miracle plays, but I didn't realize what a miracle play was like. I'd never read a description of what it was like to go to one of these. And so Tuchman writes, in the miracle plays and mysteries staged for the populace, realism was the desired effect. A system of weights and pulleys resurrected Jesus from the tomb and lifted him to a ceiling of clouds. Angels and devils were made to appear magically through trapdoors. Hell opened and closed its monstrous mouth, and Noah's flood inundated the stage from casks of water overturned backstage, while stone-filled barrows turned by cranks resounded with thunder. When John the Baptist was decapitated, the actor was whisked away so cunningly in exchange for a fake corpse and fake head-spilling ox blood that the audience shrieked in excitement. Actors playing Jesus sometimes are made tied to the cross, reciting verses for 3 hours. That actually sounds a lot more exciting than I ever imagined these miracle plays. So that was sort of interesting. And she sort of gets into the psychology of some of the people she talks about, even the more minor characters. So a last quote I have for you that I thought was really interesting was on the sort of, she didn't put it in so many words, but I would say the kind of violent eroticism of Catherine of Siena, who was later sainted or canonized. She wrote about a literal betrothal she had with Christ, and said that it was not with a ring of silver, but with a ring of his holy flesh that she was betrothed. For when, she writes, he was circumcised, just such a ring was taken from his holy body. And it says, Tuchman writes of her that Catherine read the Song of Songs over and over, repeating in her prayers the sigh of the bride, "May he kiss me with the kiss of his mouth," and was rewarded when Jesus appeared to her and bestowed upon her a kiss which filled her with unutterable sweetness. Those are Catherine of Siena's own words. So it's a way of sort of taking stuff that you've probably heard of, miracle plays, female saints having visions and all that stuff, and she just takes that and she makes it so much more real, vivid, colorful, and I just absolutely love her anecdotes that she goes on, and she has so many anecdotes. So I really felt that so far, I've not quite finished it, but I'm pretty close to finishing it, so I feel fairly confident in saying this. I really felt that the beginning of the book was the strongest. It fleshed out the medieval world sort of in a more general way, and she was really conscientious with the details, which I really enjoyed. And it just sort of made the medieval world come really alive for me. I would say that the middle of the book kind of drags. Because Tuchman goes on a number of very detailed accounts of like battles and war, And I don't necessarily find that boring. I think actually she writes about it in a very interesting way, especially because I'm used to seeing, especially this rivalry between France and England. I didn't even realize how used to it I was seeing it from the English side. I realized I'd never really seen it from the French side, how intrusive it was that the British were always coming over to their side. And I never realized how one-sided it was, that it's mostly the English invading the French rather than the other way around. So it was very interesting at first. And I kind of like knowing about like sort of the technology of war, I guess, what things they use, not just technology in terms of like material objects, but in terms of strategies and how strategy changes over time, the different fighting techniques. I think that can all be really interesting, except she just goes into so much detail and there are so many battles. You actually kind of lose track of which battle you're in or what we're even fighting for. And you already know that it's sort of a war of attrition. I mean, it's the 100 Years' War. So it's difficult, I think, to maintain a feeling of suspense. And I think Tuchman isn't really quite up to the task. Also, just having a laundry list of battle after battle after battle, you can't even tell after a while which are the important battles and which are not important. At one point, she sort of enters into yet another description, and I was thinking to myself, why are we even doing this? We already know that this doesn't go anywhere. And then Tuchman herself sort of says, well, it was an insignificant battle that made no difference in the end. But anyway, and then she just goes on and on. And so that I found a little bit tiring. And it wasn't only battle. She has a couple of chapters where she just sort of, I think of them as the laundry list battles. The laundry list chapters, where she just sort of takes a topic and then she just lists every single time that thing came up in the 14th century. So for instance, she has one chapter that's just on peasant revolutions, which I actually think is kind of interesting. But she just goes, here's the Chompy revolt, here's this other revolt in France, here's another one in Italy, here's another one. And after a while, it's just sort of like one after the other. It's just one bloody thing after the other, as some people say about history. And so I found those chapters to drag a bit. I also felt that there was one other thing that I've been very aware of while I've been reading Tuchman, that I'm always aware of when I read older history books, which is that, the events of the past might remain the same, but scholarship moves forward. And so when you're reading about a time period you're not that familiar with, like the medieval period is not my strongest suit, and it can be a little bit difficult to know when they make certain assertions whether or not that's still the current understanding of the time. So for instance, Tuchman refers repeatedly to a so-called characteristic medieval juvenility, like they're sort of inherently immature or naive. And I've come across this notion before. Sometimes it's romantic, like they're innocent and they have true feeling and true belief. And sometimes it's a bit condescending, like I think it sort of is in Tuchman. But in any case, it doesn't really sound quite current. I don't know if it is or isn't, but it just doesn't sound like an assertion that people would probably say today. She also asserts that classic kernel that medieval people didn't really care about their children because they died so frequently. And I know for a fact that that's not the current understanding. And, I think people have moved beyond that. You can read certain poems like Pearl and so on that show that that's definitely not the case for medievals. They felt just as strongly as we do about death and about the people around them, including their children. So you have to keep a little bit of an eye out and make sure that you remain perhaps a little bit more alert to things like that than you would in a newer piece of scholarship. But I mean, those things aside, I generally have found it a very fun read. It's a very easy read. It's almost a little bit like a novel. She tells a story through the eyes of a particular man who lived at this time, Kusi, and you follow his story, and then as his story unfolds, you learn about the 14th century, and I think that's really fun. Another good thing about such a wide-ranging book, because I've been thinking a lot about how much detail is in this book. Did we need to know about all of those battles in that much detail? did we need to know about every single peasant revolution in that much detail? And I think in general, I think the book probably could have used a bit of trimming. But one thing that is really cool about a wide-ranging book where an author just kind of goes for it is you are introduced to a lot of topics that maybe you hadn't given a lot of thought to before. So for me, I don't think I ever would have picked up a book on the economics of a prior period. But for example, Tuchman ends up writing quite a bit about medieval economics. And I kind of knew already about how they fixed wages and prices even after the Black Death because there was no conception of supply and demand. But I didn't understand, for instance, that this had a huge social implication in the sense that pretty much everyone just flouted the law, and therefore all these men were technically outlaws. And being an outlaw just by living your life and not being a particularly nefarious personage sort of encourages people to live on the wrong side of the law. I'm an outlaw anyway, so I may as well ... And she sort of points that out, and that's a new idea I'd never come across. So you get these market forces that seem very impersonal, really affecting things in the social landscape in a very direct way that leads to more crime and a very different conception of the peasantry and how they conceived of themselves. I thought that was really interesting, and I'd love to read more about the economics of the Middle Ages. It's interesting to see these the so-called, maybe we could call it the invisible hand, affecting people when they didn't even realize it was there. That's actually pretty interesting, and that's something that came out of Tuchman because of her dedication to I wouldn't say detail. She's not one of those granular kinds of historians where she's going to tell you what happened every single day of a particular period. But what I mean is she just kind of, she doesn't hold back. She's giving you sort of everything she's got. And I appreciate that in that way. So those are my thoughts on Tuchman for now. If anything changes, the next time I update you, I'll give you my final thoughts on the book. But I'm so close to finishing, I doubt I'll have anything else to say. But we'll see. So the second book I wanted to go over is Peter Strawson's Individuals. And this poor project got so delayed. I think I said I was starting to read this right when I started my channel like a few months ago, and it just kept getting delayed and delayed. It was supposed to be a buddy read, and then it wasn't, and then I just got very sidetracked, and I didn't actually pick up the book for a very long time after I claimed that I was reading it on this channel. And it just, I don't know, the book didn't arrive, and then I got sick, and then I was doing a bunch of other stuff, and mostly I was sort of waiting for this buddy read that never materialized. And so I wanted to talk a little bit about it now. So it's technically 8 chapters long and divided into 2 pieces. And I've only read chapter 1, but really nobody reads the second half of the book. I'll get into why later. And chapter 2 is the really important one, and I'm just starting on chapter 2. So in some ways I feel like I'm not really prepared to talk about the book, but I also feel a little bit sheepish talking about philosophy when I haven't read the piece more than once. Just because it is so dense and you want to get the terminology correct and you want to get everything right. So I thought for this discussion, I would talk a little bit more about the context of the book, because I think a lot of times it's difficult to dive into analytic philosophy as opposed to continental philosophy for a number of reasons. One is that professional analytic philosophy tends to be papers rather than books. So you're not going to just sort of get this tome that has a big system that you can sort of dig into, like with continental philosophy. But the other part of it is that in a weird way, so much is left unsaid. You have to sort of know the context of the arguments in order to understand the arguments. And I know a lot of philosophers would push back on that and say that, ideas exist in the ether and they're pure ideas and they don't need context. But I'm not referring to we can't understand Strawson unless we know what he ate for breakfast that morning. I mean that analytic philosophers generally are not going to spell out exactly what they're getting at with their books. So it requires a little bit of outside research to understand the conversation that's being had. So I thought I would focus more on that today. And then we'll be prepared to have a discussion on chapter 2 next time I talk about it. So I do want to say also that I will get things wrong here. It's very difficult to talk about philosophy sort of off the cuff, which is why I'm actually going to read out, for the first time, I've never done that on this channel before, but I'm going to read a short script that I prepared just to make sure that I get the context just right so that everyone's on the same page and we can all follow along. And I think it's a much easier way it's a less intimidating way, I think, to approach philosophy if you feel that you sort of know what's going on around the argument and what motivates this argument. So here's what I've written up. I've got it here. So Strawson's Individuals is notable both for its philosophical interest and for where it slots into the history of philosophical thought. In Individuals, Strawson takes an imaginative leap and asks, is it possible to imagine a way of thinking about the world where we still have real objective objects or things, but where those objects' physicality in space as material bodies is not the fundamental way that we conceive of or understand them? Another way of phrasing it might be, can we conceive of objective things without picturing them as things in space? This is pretty difficult because when you think about it, our conceptual scheme of how we understand things is built up around the world of material objects. But what, for example, if we had a world of pure sound? Could we imagine coming to the understanding of objective particulars in such a world? The question is interesting in itself, but it's also interesting in terms of the story of philosophy at this time. Strawson published Individuals in 1959, and among other things, it was an attempt to resuscitate metaphysics after it fell into ill repute. In the 19th century, British philosophy was dominated by Hegelian idealism, which holds that reality is ultimately an expression of Geist, or spirit, unfolding through dialectical stages. I'm sure many of you are familiar with that. Hegel argued that you can't know the world by analyzing isolated bits, but must see each part in relation to the whole. On this view, mind and world can't be separated. In the British tradition at Oxford, they argued in the Hegelian mold that reality is fundamentally mental or spiritual, and that ordinary experience is incomplete or fragmentary. At the same time, though, mathematics went through a transformation in the 19th century, with things like set theory and functions transforming what kinds of problems math could tackle. Mathematicians increasingly ran into new paradoxes, which motivated new and ambitious kinds of system building, most notably for philosophy, the work of Gottlob Frege, who in 1879 essentially invented formal logic. That's a little bit of an overstatement. Predecessors like Boole and others were also important. And formal logic is much, much more powerful than the Aristotelian syllogisms that had dominated philosophy for the 2,000 years before Frege. Frege wasn't really recognized at the time, but he was a great inspiration to people like Bertrand Russell and the early Ludwig Wittgenstein. With the advent of formal logic, suddenly philosophy could be much more precise and mathematical in its statements, and Hegelian idealism, and metaphysics along with it, unfortunately, seemed increasingly vague and even useless. The logical positivists of the Vienna Circle, in fact, broadly deemed metaphysics nonsense. For them, philosophy as a discipline needed to be much more scientific and mathematical. They believed that only statements that are empirically verifiable or logically true, such as all bachelors are unmarried, are meaningful, and thus considered most metaphysics meaningless. They believed that philosophical problems largely arise from the misuse of language, and that we should try to clarify language by purifying it to match a precise logical form. Russell wasn't a logical positivist, but he too argues that ordinary language is misleading and imprecise, and that we should break down ordinary statements into precise logical forms. Strawson represents the next generation's pushing back against these positivist prejudices. Individuals is part of his project to resuscitate metaphysics and show that it could be done in a rigorous, precise way in fitting with philosophy's new, more logical modern garb. It's also part of what's known as ordinary language philosophy, which considers ordinary language not defective, but in fact sophisticated and worthy of investigation. On this view, philosophical problems arise not because of the imprecision of ordinary language, but when philosophers misunderstand how ordinary language works. We should therefore look at how logic is embedded in everyday speech, not attempt to replace it. By undertaking what Strawson calls descriptive metaphysics, as opposed to revisionary metaphysics, Strawson attempts to do just that in individuals, to examine how our conceptual scheme actually seems to work, rather than prescribe how it must be. In doing so, Strawson is in a way reskinning Kant for the modern era. Kant believed that space and time are a priori forms of structural experience. And here Strawson comes to a similar conclusion, that our shared conceptual scheme for understanding objective particulars relies upon space and time, though he takes the imaginative leap of considering what our conceptual scheme might look like if that were not so. The book consists of 8 chapters, which comprise 2 distinct parts. Part 1, composed of the first 4 chapters, focuses on our ability to refer to and think about objects in our environment, while the second part focuses on the distinction between subject expressions and predicate expressions, which you could argue is not even really metaphysics, but philosophy of language. It's the first part of the book that's got the fireworks, though. People don't generally read the second part, and I'm not sure I'll go on to read the second part either. Even the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, which is the first stop for anyone wanting to know more about philosophical topics, including professional philosophers, notes that, quote, the book's colossal and immediate impact was due primarily to the brilliance and originality of its first 3 chapters. The truth is that reading the argument developed in those chapters generates a continuous intellectual excitement, which the later chapters do not quite match. So instead of finishing the book, I'll likely read some secondary literature on the first part, such as Gareth Evans' article, Things Without the Mind, which exclusively considers chapter 2. My copy of Individuals also has an essay, an extra essay Strawson wrote reflecting on the book 35 years after it was first published, which is why I specially bought that edition. With regard to what I've read so far, chapter 1 is a lot of scene setting. Strawson considers how exactly we pick out objects in order to talk about them with others. One way we do so is by picking out an object we're currently perceiving, for example, this page. Our interlocutor can then pick out the same object. A second case is where the referent is picked out because of a description, which Strawson claims ultimately needs to be related to currently perceived objects somehow in order for both the speaker and the listener to pick out the same object. This could be something like the author of this page. With a spatio-temporal system, we can use ourselves, like our physical selves, as the currently perceived anchor for the referent, which makes it possible for us to refer to just about anything. From these observations, Strawson determines that bodies are referentially basic. So we don't think of things in terms of sense data or little particles coming into our eyes, but the basic primordial unit of understanding is an object, is what that's saying. So it's in chapter 2, which I'm just starting, where Strawson gets to the juicy stuff. He asks, can there be thought about objective entities which doesn't involve thinking of them in spatial terms? Would sound alone, which Strawson considers to be non-spatial, be enough for a creature to understand the notion of objective particulars? So to make it more clear here, he's trying to pose the question of what it takes to be a, quote, ordinary object, and how rich an environment has to be to house material objects. So is a purely auditory world, for example, sufficiently rich to provide conditions for taking our experience to be... oh, got a phone call. So is a purely auditory world, for example, sufficiently rich to provide conditions for taking our experience to be the experience of mind-independent objects? According to the SCP, or the Stanford Encyclopedia of Philosophy, Strawson concludes that it is. Quote, he imagines that individual sounds could be related to a continuous so-called master sound, which could define something in a way analogous to how we use space in our own conceptual scheme. Thus, he seems to conclude that even though spatio-temporal thinking isn't required per se, there must always be something in the subject's way of thinking which performs a role analogous to the role that thought about space performs for us. For my part, I don't think I'm deep enough into the argument to have much of an opinion yet, but I just love the audacity of the attempt. I have mixed feelings on analytic philosophy as a discipline. One of the areas of frustration I have with it is its timidity in asking big questions. It feels like so much of what we wonder about when we get interested in philosophy in the first place, in the hands of the analytic tradition, gets domesticated into smaller, more manageable, less meaningful problems that, while trivially solvable, also fail to address the interest of the original questions. I like that Strawson is going for something bigger in individuals, and I'm excited to see what he comes up with in his Sound World thought experiment. So I hope that wasn't too hard to follow all at once. I tried to make it as conversational as I could, but that's kind of the scene setting for when I get into chapter 2 next time, and I think, be able to have a little bit more opinion on what I think of the argument. So that's all I really have to say on Strawson for now. The next thing I wanted to talk about was just smaller things, non-book stuff. I wanted to talk about some stuff I'm doing in language learning. So I discovered a pretty cool, it seems so far, new app or course or curriculum. It's called Linguisticator. And what I really like about it is that it's grammar first. So I'm trying to learn German. I mean, I've been trying to learn German for a while. It's sort of a labor of love and suffering. And I think I really like German because I really like grammar, and most curricula for language learning are trying to get you as far away from grammar as humanly possible, on the assumption that you hate grammar and you want to learn like a baby, or like you did when you were a child, or through conversation or through reading. I think all of those things are not wrong. I think people have different ways of learning, and some people are very vocabulary first. In fact, a lot of people would say that vocabulary is a lot more interesting and important than grammar if you're actually learning to try to speak. I'm learning as a hobby for fun. I would really love one day to be able to read German philosophy and maybe poetry, but that's a long way off. I'm learning because I like the learning of it itself, and because I actually enjoy grammar. So for me, a lot of these courses that try to erase the grammar are sort of erasing the juicy stuff for me. So I like that this is a grammar first curriculum, which I've never seen before, and it makes a lot of big claims that once you learn the sort of general map of the language, the vocabulary comes very easily and things like that. And I don't know that this is the only way to learn. Like I said, I think for a lot of people, learning through conversation or learning through immersion and all that can be really, really great. I don't think they're wrong. It's just that people have different styles, and I guess my style is more grammar first. The only thing about it that I'm a little bit skeptical about is that a key part of this curriculum is using memory palaces and sort of memory strategies so that you can kind of memorize this map of the grammar of the language. I'm more skeptical about that, but I'm willing to remain agnostic and see where it takes me, just because I'm so excited to have a grammar first curriculum. So I've just started on it like a couple of days ago, and so I can't really say what the outcome is yet. But for anyone else that's interested in language learning, it's an interesting option. They've got a lot of different languages on there, and I think I'll see where it takes me. It's pretty original. It's an original way of looking at it. So I also thought it was kind of funny that I'm starting on this just as I'm reading Strawson, because while Strawson's considering whether we can differentiate objects without recourse to space, memory palaces work by turning non-spatial items like words into space, because it's easier to remember that way. So in Strawson, we're trying to think about, can we even think about things without space? And in Linguisticator, it's saying, just turn everything into space. That it's just easier. Let's just admit it. It's easier. So it's kind of a funny parallel. The only other thing I had to talk about was I've been taking on and off a course on opera for a little while. So I subscribe to the Great Courses, which is, it's basically like Netflix, but with professors. So you log in, and there's like these streaming courses that you can take on all different topics like history and math and science, and a lot on music. And I really like the music courses because there's one particular professor, he's much beloved, who does most of the music courses. And I thought, I've never really, I don't know anything about opera. I'm a completely naive newbie at opera, but I really like vocal music. So I decided to start taking it a while ago. And I'm sort of nearing the maybe 3/4 mark in that course, and I thought, why don't I just start watching operas, like full operas? So I've so far watched Monteverdi's Orfeo and parts of the Magic Flute. I'm just finishing up the Magic Flute. And for anyone else who might be interested, if you're in the United States, it's pretty easy to get your hands on these operas. You can generally watch on an app called Hoopla, which Hoopla, which is available through most public libraries. And on Hoopla, they've got a few operas already in the app, but there's also another thing you can get within Hoopla, which is called a binge pass, and it gives you access to another app. It's all, it's not as complicated as it sounds when I'm explaining it, but it gives you a 7-day pass to another app called Medici TV, which just specializes in opera and stage productions. And it has way, way more operas. When I was choosing the Magic Flute, I actually had my choice between 4 productions of the Magic Flute. So it's very cool to just poke around in there. So yeah, I have my thoughts on Orfeo. I actually really liked Orfeo a lot. I loved the music. The music is completely delightful. There's a natural flow between recitative and arias, so it just kind of feels like it's all one beautiful river of song. I just loved it. I thought the production was kind of this weird minimalist modernist thing that I usually don't go for, but in this particular production, I thought it was very, very effective. I really liked everything about it, and I thought that was interesting because Orfeo is supposed to be kind of the first true, real opera that has the whole deal, recitative and arias and the structure and everything. So I was expecting something a little bit more primitive, but I actually really enjoyed it, including all of the music. I will say that the ending was a little bit weird. If you know the story of Orpheus and Eurydice, which here is always Orfeo and Eurydice, it's very unexpected because Orfeo turns around, Eurydice is cast away forever from him, and then at the moment of his greatest despair, this weird, awkward Christian message is just sort of interposed into the narrative very bizarrely. And Orfeo just sort of ascends up to heaven immediately after losing Eurydice, and everything's great. And I think the darker ancient ending is kind of better. So that's a little bit of a bummer, but the rest of the production and the rest of the opera was really, really good. I really enjoyed it. With the Magic Flute, I'm not enjoying it as much as Orfeo, which is probably why I didn't finish it in one sitting. It's about 2 hours and 40 minutes long, so it's quite a bit longer than Orfeo. And I'm about a half an hour away from finishing. But the story, so this is, for anyone who doesn't know, this is an opera by Mozart. It was actually put into production I think it was a couple of months before Mozart died. The story is a bit muddled, and it's very different. It's a very different style. So, for instance, this is a German, technically Singspiel, which means like a singing play. So it doesn't have recitative. It has singing portions and then speaking portions. Maybe a little bit more like a modern musical we would have today. But even though when I first started looking into opera, I found recitative a little bit boring and I didn't really know why it was there, I really missed it in the Magic Flute. It's because you have all this music and then everything just becomes completely silent and mute. And so it adds gravity, but it also sort of interrupts the flow and the energy of it. And I could really appreciate the role of recitative when it wasn't there anymore. But I do think that it's fun to try something new where your tastes are still forming and you discover new things about yourself. I never would have thought that recitative was all that important to me, but I think I really enjoy it. I also picked up the Magic Flute, which is way, way later, way after Orfeo, because the course I'm following makes a big deal about the differences in musical style that the different language structures of Italian and German require. And that seemed, as a language learner, that seemed really interesting to me. But the singing in German is not as different from the singing in Italian as I was led to believe from the course. I thought it was going to be something like in every note or every syllable can only have one note or something. So I thought, oh wow, the German will sound completely different from the Italian. But it's true you can detect a little bit of a difference, but it just wasn't as dramatic as I expected. I mean, the most notable thing is that after a really, really long note, in the German, you'll suddenly get this consonant cluster at the very end of the word, so or something like that. But I think that it still sounds really elegant, and I didn't really feel that it was a huge difference, really. I think that they pull it off really nicely, and I think the course instructor sort of exaggerated a little bit, like how much of a deal that would be. I think it's just sort of I think it's more so differences in national, probably like national sentiment than anything inherent to the sounds of the language. But that's just me. I'm still a pretty naive listener, so if you disagree or you have another point about it, please let me know, because I'm curious about it. The other part that was really cool about it being in German was it was a really strange sensation to understand parts of it. Like, it feels like it's almost a part of the enjoyment or the beauty of opera that you have no idea what's being said. So, and not understanding the words kind of feels like it's appropriate to opera because it's just total emotion and you have to get the story details from this other part of your brain or something. But yeah, it makes me really want to try opera in English next to see what that would even feel like. It sounds totally bizarre. And that actually leads me to my very last point, which is I've got a list of operas to watch, including some in English. And when I was looking around for English operas, I stumbled on to one of the most bizarre things imaginable, which is a 1987 opera entitled Nixon in China, which dramatizes Nixon's diplomatic trip to China in 1972. I watched part of it and I tried to keep an an open mind, but ultimately it was really difficult to take it seriously. I don't know if it's just because it was in English or it's about a crooked politician or what, but it was really strange to watch. So I'll leave you all on that note, literally, with a short clip of Nixon in China, and you can decide what you think, and I'll see you next time. So see you later. Bye-bye.
Your flight was smooth, I hope, oh yes, smoother than usual, I guess. Yes, it was very pleasant. We stopped in Hawaii for a day and want to catch up on the time. It's easier that way. The Prime Minister knows about that. He's such a traveler. No, not I. But as a traveler, from home for good to China, one for whom all travel is a penance now, I am most proud to welcome you. I am most proud to welcome you. As a kind of mystery, as a kind of mystery. When I shook hands, Joe and I, when I shook hands, Joe and I, on this bare field outside meeting, just now the whole world was listening. The whole world was listening. though we spoke quietly, and though we spoke quietly, and though we spoke quietly, the eyes and ears of history, 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 caught every gesture, caught every gesture, caught every gesture and every word transforming us as we transfixed the deputy, transforming us as we transfixed the minister, transforming us as we transfixed, made history, history, as we made history. The eyes and ears of history, as we made history. On our flight over from Shanghai, the countryside looked drab and grey. Bridal Pat said, we came in peace for all mankind. I said, we came in peace for all mankind, and I was put in mind of our Apollo astronauts, simply achieving a great human dream. We live in an unsettled time. We live in an unsettled time. Who are our enemies? Who are our friends? Who are our friends? The Eastern Hemisphere beckoned to us, and we have flown east of the sun, west of the moon, across an ocean of distrust, filled with the bodies of our lost, the earth's sea of tranquility, the earth's sea of tranquility, tranquility, the earth's sea. News, it's prime time in the USA. It's prime time in the USA. It's yesterday night. It's yesterday night. Yesterday night. They watch us now. The three main networks' colors glow, livid through drapes onto the lawn. Dishes are washed and homework done. The dog and grandma fall asleep. A car roars past, play loud pop. This car. As I look down the road, I know America is good at heart. An old cold warrior piloting towards an unknown shore through shoals. The rats begin to chew. The rats begin to chew the sheets. The rats begin to chew the sheets. The rats begin to chew the sheets. There's murmuring down below. There's murmuring. Now there's ingratitude. My hand is steady as a rock. A sound like morning doves reaches my ears. Nobody is a friend of ours. The nation's heartland skips a beat as our hands shield the spinning globe from the flamethrowers of the mob. Must press on. We know we want. Mr. President. Mr. President.